17th July, 1942. By the summer of 1942, World War II had grown into a global catastrophe unlike anything humanity had ever witnessed. What had begun as a regional conflict had transformed into a brutal worldwide struggle involving dozens of nations. Entire continents were consumed by war. Cities burned, populations were displaced, and millions had already lost their lives. The greatest military powers on Earth were now locked in a fight for survival, dominance, and ideological supremacy. At the heart of this conflict stood Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. By this point in the war, Hitler's armies had crushed much of Western Europe beneath their boots. Poland had been erased from the map. France had fallen in a matter of weeks. The Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, and Denmark were under German control. Nazi banners flew across occupied capitals, and to many observers around the world, Germany appeared unstoppable. But Hitler was not satisfied. His ambitions extended far beyond Western Europe. His gaze turned eastward, toward Eastern Europe and the vast lands of the Soviet Union. These territories represented everything Germany lacked: land, manpower, raw materials, and most importantly, oil. Among all these objectives, one city began to dominate Hitler's thinking more than any other.
That city was Stalingrad.
Stalingrad was not merely an industrial center. It carried immense symbolic weight. The city bore the name of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin himself. Capturing it would deal a devastating psychological blow to the Soviet Union. It would strike directly at Stalin's authority while cutting off vital supply routes along the Volga River. To Hitler, Stalingrad represented the opportunity to win the war in the East with one decisive victory. But Stalin was not a man who retreated easily. For Stalin, the defense of Stalingrad became deeply personal. Losing the city that carried his name was unthinkable. He tied its fate to his own authority and to the survival of the Soviet state. Orders were issued that the city would be defended at all costs. Retreat was not an option.
When German and Soviet forces finally collided, the result was catastrophic. Blood flowed through the streets. Death ruled every factory floor, every shattered apartment, and every underground cellar. For months, the fighting raged without mercy. The German Luftwaffe launched relentless bombing campaigns, turning Stalingrad into a sea of ruins. Entire neighborhoods vanished under explosions. Early German advances reinforced Hitler's belief that victory was inevitable. But the true turning point had not yet arrived. As winter approached, the balance of the war began to shift. The brutal Russian cold, capable of freezing weapons, engines, and human bodies alike, became a deadly force of its own. Stalin used the winter months to regroup, reorganize, and prepare a massive counterattack. When the Red Army finally struck back, it did so with overwhelming force. German units, stretched thin and exhausted, began to collapse. The Battle of Stalingrad lasted nearly 7 months. By the end, the city was completely destroyed. Its streets had become a vast graveyard. Nearly 1.9 million soldiers were killed or wounded, making it the bloodiest battle in human history. So how did Hitler's seemingly unstoppable army fall apart? How did Stalin transform near defeat into victory? And how did Hitler's obsession with Stalingrad become one of the decisive causes of his downfall in World War II? When World War I ended in 1918, Germany emerged defeated, humiliated, and economically shattered. The victorious Allied powers blamed Germany for the war and imposed severe punishments through the Treaty of Versailles. Germany lost its overseas colonies, large portions of its territory, and the right to maintain a powerful military. On top of that, it was forced to pay enormous war reparations, amounting to roughly $5 billion. The economic consequences were devastating. Inflation spiraled out of control. Savings became worthless. Millions of Germans lost their jobs. Hunger and poverty spread across cities and rural areas alike. Daily life became a struggle for survival. The newly formed Weimar Republic, which had accepted the treaty's terms, was widely viewed as weak, corrupt, and responsible for Germany's suffering. Public anger grew rapidly. Among those who exploited this anger was Adolf Hitler. During World War I, Hitler had served as a soldier in the German army. He repeatedly risked his life delivering messages across the battlefield under enemy fire. He was wounded during the war and later awarded the Iron Cross for bravery. These experiences deeply shaped his worldview and allowed him to present himself as a loyal patriot who had sacrificed for Germany. In 1919, Hitler joined the German Workers' Party. Through powerful speeches, emotional rhetoric, and carefully crafted propaganda, he transformed it into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, commonly known as the Nazi Party. By exploiting Germany's humiliation and promising national revival, he attracted millions of desperate supporters. By 1932, the Nazi Party had become the largest political force in Germany. In January 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Hitler as chancellor. Within a short time, Hitler dismantled Germany's democratic institutions, eliminated political opposition, and established a totalitarian dictatorship through intimidation, censorship, and violence. Despite securing total control over Germany, Hitler faced a major problem. The country lacked critical natural resources. To prepare Germany for war, he launched massive economic and industrial programs, withdrew from the League of Nations, and openly violated the Treaty of Versailles. In March 1936, German troops remilitarized the Rhineland. The move was illegal under international law, but no nation intervened. Encouraged by this lack of resistance, Hitler became increasingly aggressive. He promoted intense anti-Soviet propaganda, portraying communism as Germany's greatest ideological enemy. To counter it, Germany formed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Japan, later joined by Italy. Germany soon annexed Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia, strengthening both its economy and military. Each success emboldened Hitler further, pushing Europe closer to war. Fearing a two-front conflict, Hitler stunned the world in August 1939 by signing a non-aggression pact with Stalin. In secret clauses, both sides agreed to divide Poland between them. On 1 September 1939, German forces invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war days later. World War II had begun. Shortly afterward, Soviet troops entered Poland from the east. In June 1941, Hitler shattered the Non-Aggression Pact and launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in history. German forces were divided into three massive groups: Army Group North, advancing toward Leningrad; Army Group Center, driving toward Moscow; Army Group South, pushing into Ukraine and toward the Caucasus. Using blitzkrieg tactics, German armies advanced at extraordinary speed, encircling and destroying entire Soviet formations. However, the Soviet leadership responded strategically. As they retreated, they implemented a scorched earth policy, destroying infrastructure, crops, and supplies to deny the Germans resources. Then winter arrived, early and unforgiving. German supply lines collapsed, vehicles froze, soldiers lacked winter clothing. On 5 December 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive near Moscow. Unprepared for winter warfare, German troops suffered devastating losses. Operation Barbarossa had failed. By early 1942, the Eastern Front had already become the largest and most brutal battlefield in human history. Stretching thousands of kilometers across forests, plains, and frozen rivers, it consumed men, machines, and entire armies at a terrifying pace. What had begun as a lightning-fast German invasion the year before was slowly transforming into a war of endurance, one that neither side could easily escape. For Adolf Hitler, the war in the East was never merely about military conquest. It was ideological, economic, and personal. He believed Germany's future depended on destroying the Soviet Union and seizing its vast resources. Above all, Germany needed oil. Without it, tanks would not move, aircraft would not fly, and the war machine would grind to a halt. The failure of Operation Barbarossa in late 1941 had shaken German confidence. Moscow had not fallen. The Red Army had survived. Winter had exposed fatal weaknesses in German planning. Yet Hitler refused to accept that his strategy was flawed. Instead of reassessing, he doubled down. In the summer of 1942, Hitler shifted his attention south. His new plan, Operation Case Blue, focused on capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus. These oil reserves, Hitler believed, would fuel Germany's war for years to come. But standing between the German army and those oil fields was a long industrial city stretched along the western bank of the Volga River, Stalingrad. On paper, Stalingrad was not Germany's primary objective. It was not the capital of the Soviet Union, nor was it the largest city in the region. But in reality, it represented something far more dangerous. The city carried the name of Joseph Stalin. For Hitler, capturing Stalingrad promised a symbolic victory as powerful as any military success. Taking the city would humiliate Stalin, damage Soviet morale, and serve as proof that the Nazi war machine could crush even the heart of Soviet identity. Hitler became obsessed with the idea that Stalingrad must fall, not because it was easy to take, but because it carried meaning. At the same time, Stalingrad held immense strategic value. It was a major industrial hub, producing weapons, vehicles, and equipment for the Red Army. Even more importantly, it sat along the Volga River, one of the Soviet Union's most vital supply routes. Oil, food, and raw materials flowed through Stalingrad toward the north. If Germany cut this artery, the Soviet war effort would suffer a devastating blow. German generals warned Hitler of the risks. They argued that the German army was already stretched thin. Supply lines ran hundreds of kilometers back through hostile territory. Dividing forces between Stalingrad and the Caucasus would weaken both offensives. But Hitler no longer trusted his generals. He believed willpower and determination could overcome any obstacle. Against all advice, he ordered the German Sixth Army to advance on Stalingrad. As German forces moved eastward across the southern Soviet Union, the scale of the landscape worked against them. Distances were enormous, roads were poor, railways were limited. Every kilometer gained increased the strain on fuel, ammunition, and food supplies. What looked manageable on a map became a logistical nightmare on the ground. Meanwhile, Stalin watched closely. The Soviet leader had learned painful lessons during the first year of the war. He understood that retreat alone would not stop the Germans. Cities, factories, and lives had already been lost. Now the line had to be drawn somewhere. For Stalin, Stalingrad became that line. Orders were issued that the city must not fall. Workers were told to keep factories running even as bombs fell nearby. Civilians were mobilized to dig trenches, build barricades, and prepare defensive positions. Entire divisions were rushed toward the Volga, often crossing the river under German fire. The message from Moscow was clear. Stalingrad would be defended at all cost. By late summer 1942, German forces reached the outskirts of the city. The Luftwaffe began one of the most destructive bombing campaigns of the war. Day after day, waves of bombers turned Stalingrad into a burning ruin. Entire neighborhoods vanished. Fires raged uncontrollably. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed within weeks. Ironically, the destruction of the city worked against Germany. The ruins eliminated the advantage of German tanks and mobility. Streets became impassable. Buildings collapsed into defensive positions. What had once been a modern city turned into a maze of rubble, perfect for close-quarters combat. As German troops pushed deeper, they found themselves fighting not for kilometers, but for meters. Every building, every staircase, every room became a battlefield. The Red Army adapted quickly, fighting at point-blank range to neutralize German air power and artillery. This form of warfare became known as hugging the enemy, a brutal tactic that forced German soldiers into constant, exhausting combat. By the time autumn arrived, both sides were bleeding heavily. German units were worn down. Soviet forces suffered massive casualties, but continued to feed fresh troops into the city. Stalingrad became a grinder that consumed everything thrown into it. Then the weather began to change. Temperatures dropped. Rain turned streets into mud. Soon snow followed. German soldiers, still equipped for summer operations, struggled to cope. Vehicles froze. Weapons malfunctioned. Frostbite claimed lives without a single shot being fired. Behind the scenes, the Soviet High Command was preparing something far larger than street fighting. While German attention remained fixed on the city itself, Soviet forces quietly assembled on the flanks. Entire armies were positioned north and south of Stalingrad, targeting the weaker Axis units, Romanian and Hungarian troops guarding the German Sixth Army sides. The stage was being set for a decisive counterstroke. By November 1942, the road to Stalingrad had become a dead end for the German army. What had begun as a confident advance driven by ambition and pride had turned into a trap. German forces were deep inside hostile territory, surrounded by ruins, winter, and a determined enemy. Stalingrad was no longer just a city. It was a test of endurance, leadership, and will. And soon, it would decide the fate of the entire Eastern Front.